Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chrystia Freeland. I'm the Foreign Minister of Canada, and I'm delighted to be with you here today as co-host of the first Global Conference on Media Freedom. And I would like to start by thanking the British government and my friend, Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt, for the tremendous organization of this conference, for having the idea of holding it in the first place, and for welcoming us all to London. And you even organized really good weather. Je suis très heureuse de me joindre à vous aujourd'hui. Permettez-moi de souligner le bon travail que vous faites pour faire progresser les droits de la personne à travers le monde.
She's just repeating everything that's been said in English, in French.
D'un enjeu très important pour le Canada, parce que nous comprenons à quel point la liberté d'expression et de la presse.
We understand to what extent the freedom of expression for the press are absolutely essential. When human rights are protected, governments are more reasonable, and the quality of life of people is improved.
But my first job in life was as a journalist. And my career as a journalist began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when I studied and worked in what was first the Soviet Union, and while I was living there, became the former Soviet Union. That experience of watching from the inside as this vast, mighty authoritarian regime crumbled profoundly shaped my thinking about democracy and about the importance of the brave journalists who helped create democracy in those times. Journalists hold governments accountable, knowing that we will face scrutiny and questions, that we, as political leaders, are not going to be grading our own work, makes us much better than we would otherwise be, even if we don't always feel that way in the throes of particularly heated press conferences. Transparency builds citizens' faith and confidence in their governments and in democracy. That's why journalists must have the ability to report facts freely and to defend, expose, and advance the truth without fear of retaliation, reprisal, violence, or imprisonment. Today, journalism is difficult and dangerous work. UNESCO reports that last year alone, 99 members of the media were killed around the world. And by the end of last year, Reporters Without Frontiers says 348 journalists were in prison. In fact, the 4 deadliest recorded years for journalists have occurred within the past decade. Some cases have captured international attention in recent months, like the gruesome murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the illegal detention by Russia of Ukrainian writer and filmmaker Oleg Sentsov, and the harassment and intimidation of Philippine journalist and activist Maria Reza. On occasion, our efforts to defend the world's brave journalists are successful. Reuters reporters Wallon and Quan Chi, who were detained in Myanmar for daring to report on the horrific genocide being committed against the Rohingya, were released in early May. In Russia, questionable charges against journalist Ivan Golunov were dropped after pressure from journalists in that country itself, and he was subsequently set free. These instances are a reminder that when we work together, when we speak out together, we can make a difference. Democracy is not just about elections, and it's not just about politicians. It is about a much broader set of institutions, including a vibrant and vocal civil society and a free and independent media. We need to speak out for those who are persecuted for doing their job, even when we are told that matters such as these should only be raised in private, and even when speaking out brings consequences. Rest assured that Canada will always defend press freedom. I'm particularly thankful to everyone who is here for the work you do as journalists, as defenders of journalists around the world. Thank you for your commitment. Okay, now I'm going to move to my Master of Ceremonies duties, and I'm going to start by introducing my fellow speakers. The first is actually a woman who needs no introduction, who played an instrumental role in the liberation of those Myanmar reporters. She is a well-known defender of human rights. She's also a barrister and a key driver behind the independent panel of legal experts that is beginning its work this week as part of the deliverables of this conference. So please welcome the amazing Amal Clooney.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to address you today. I am a human rights lawyer, and in my work, I often see that advocacy for human rights is a fight for the next generation. We can easily take for granted rights that we only enjoy because of the courage of those who came before us. I can only practice as a barrister because of the advocacy of women 100 years ago in this country who fought for the right to study and practice law on the same basis as men. A gay person can today marry the person they love only thanks to advocacy campaigns that began a generation ago. But progress is not inevitable. We can also move backwards. And when it comes to the right to a free press, we are seeing, according to Freedom House, the 13th consecutive year of decline across the globe. This decline in media freedom doesn't only mean that journalists have fewer rights, it means we all have. Because as James Madison, one of America's founding fathers, warned us more than 200 years ago, the right to a free press is the only effectual guardian of every other right. Yet today, journalists are under attack like never before. They are dying not only while covering wars, but because they are exposing crimes committed in war, exposing abuses of power committed in peacetime. In the last 18 months, over 100 journalists and media workers have been killed. India and Brazil, two of the world's largest democracies, have some of the highest murder rates. The vast majority of these murders go unpunished. And last year, when Jamal Khashoggi, Washington Post columnist, was tortured to death and dismembered by Saudi Arabian officials in Istanbul, world leaders responded with little more than a collective shrug. Journalists are also being jailed in record numbers, with the highest rates reported in Turkey, China, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. I am a witness in my legal practice to the challenges faced by journalists. I've represented journalists targeted by their governments for reporting corruption and human rights abuse from Azerbaijan to the Maldives to Cairo, and my foundation's Trial Watch initiative monitors the prosecution of journalists all over the world. Over the past year, I have also spent hundreds of hours working on the defense of Reuters journalists Wallone and Chassaou, heroic young reporters imprisoned in Myanmar for violating the Official Secrets Act after they wrote an article about the execution of 10 Rohingya men by Myanmar security forces. The government's treatment of these journalists is so outrageous, it's actually hard to believe. The phone rings in the Reuters office one evening. The police asks the journalists to meet at a cafe. When they walk into the cafe, they're handed rolled up documents. When they walk out of the cafe, they're arrested for espionage. When they were in prison, the police didn't even bother to pretend they were interested in supposedly secret documents they were carrying. Instead, they were asked about the sources for that Rohingya report, and they offered to drop the charges if Reuters were to drop the story. When that offer was refused, they were put on trial. And then something extraordinary happened in the courtroom. A police officer called by the prosecution to testify against them confessed that the journalist's arrest was a setup. But the judges convicted them anyway, and they were sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. It took over a year to secure a pardon for the Reuters journalists, but on the 6th of May, they walked out of the prison gates to be reunited with their wives and baby daughters, one of whom, baby Angel, was born while her father was in prison. And 6 weeks ago, they went to New York because they were awarded the Pulitzer Prize for that Rohingya report. recently, I have been appointed as counsel for another award-winning journalist, Reza. Ms. Reza was CNN's bureau chief in Jakarta and Manila before she teamed up with 3 other women to set up an independent news site. Their site, Rappler.com, quickly became one of the leading online news portals in the Philippines, known for its hard-hitting stories about human rights abuses under the administration of President Rodrigo Duterte. Last year, Ms. Reza was one of 4 journalists named as Time magazine's Person of the Year for what Time called, quote, great risks in pursuit of greater truth. The government's response has been to arrest her and initiate a series of civil and criminal cases that expose her to a maximum sentence of 63 years in prison. The Maria Ressa case in the Philippines, like the Reuters case in Myanmar, exposes a cruel irony that I see time and time again in my work. Journalists who expose abuses face arrest, while those who commit the abuses do so with impunity. Crimes allegedly committed by the authorities in Myanmar and the Philippines are currently being examined by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, yet so far it's only the reporters going to jail. Now you may think that these problems only affect people in far-off lands, but you would be wrong. These problems are global, and they exist even in countries that otherwise have a strong tradition of free speech. No region is untouched. For instance, many people don't know that journalists have been murdered because they are journalists, even in Europe, in places like Malta and Slovakia. Australia's Parliament just launched an inquiry into press freedom after police raided Sydney headquarters of the ABC News channel, alleging that classified material was used in a report on killings by Australian forces in Afghanistan. In this country, 2 journalists were recently arrested for using a leaked Ombudsman report in a documentary alleging police collusion in a murder in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And the indictment against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has alarmed journalists at newspapers around the world, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Guardian, because, as the editor of the Washington Post has put it, it, quote, criminalizes common practices in journalism that have long served the public interest. With many governments also insulting and threatening journalists and seeking to throttle media organizations through strict controls on ownership, licensing, and online activity, we have reached the point where there are few places in the world where journalists are not surveilled, harassed, disenfranchised, or subject to self-censorship. I should not need to explain to this audience why this is so consequential. In the last story that Jamal Khashoggi wrote in the Washington Post, he lamented the fact that the vast majority of countries in the Arab world lack a free press, and that as a result, millions of Arabs are either uninformed or misinformed. This is true in other parts of the world as well, meaning democracy cannot work, meaning progress is restrained or thwarted, and human rights abuse, any abuse, can occur in the dark. So it is clear that the challenges to media freedom are urgent, and they are global. But an international campaign like the one being launched today can only bring about positive change if governments are willing to pay more than lip service to the ideal of media freedom. All governments say they support press freedom. The right is even enshrined in North Korea's constitution. What matters is enforcement of that right, and enforcement depends on states. So I am grateful to the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, and to Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland for bringing us all here today. I'm grateful for their assistance in cases where I have represented detained journalists. And I'm grateful that today they are shining a light on the importance of media freedom around the world. But my message to all the ministers who are here is that signing pledges and making speeches is not enough. They must make sure that their laws respect media freedom and that their police, prosecutors, judges, and citizens do the same. States must ensure that when a journalist is attacked, this crime is investigated and that those responsible are held to account. States should ensure that when a journalist is detained, they have access to legal counsel and open monitoring of their trial. States can provide more robust consular assistance when their nationals are arrested abroad for their reporting. They can provide special visas for persecuted journalists who need asylum, and they can impose targeted sanctions and other penalties on states that try to silence critical speech by detaining or killing journalists. States can make a concrete commitment today by contributing to the Global Media Defense Fund that has been established to help journalists access legal assistance and training. And I hope they will support the work of the new independent international legal panel that I will introduce tomorrow. Recent reports suggest that today, only 1 in 10 people in the world lives in a country with a free press. And today, the country of James Madison has a leader who vilifies the media, making honest journalists all over the world more vulnerable to abuse. With authoritarianism, isolationism, and nationalism gaining ground, the relevance of international institutions and respect for international norms are seriously in question. I believe it is this crisis of the international rule of law that makes this initiative compelling. It is compelling not because the international system works, but because it is broken. So we need groups of like-minded states that will move forward on one issue, even if they are paralyzed on others. That is why I am supporting this campaign, and I look forward to working with many of you to see what we can achieve. Thank you.
Okay, you may have noticed Amal is a little taller than I am. Thank you very much, Amal. That was really vivid and inspiring. I think we all appreciated those remarks. Our next speaker is one of the people doing the kind of difficult and dangerous and important work that Amal has been describing. She is an investigative reporter from Venezuela and the co-founder of the independent news website Efecto Cocoyo. She was awarded the 2018 International Press Freedom Award from the Committee to Protect Journalists and was spotlighted in the 2018 edition of Time Person of the Year. So please join me in welcoming Luz Mely Reyes. Luz?
Good evening.
Bonsoir.
I am a journalist working in an hostile environment. I am looking to be here to tell our story. In 1999, in Venezuela, a very charismatic leader pointed to a group of journalists and told to his audience, "They are my enemies." 20 years later, the independent media industry in Venezuela has been devastated. The media landscape in Venezuela has changed dramatically because of a confluence of economic crisis, government repression, and company acquisition. Plus, independent newspaper are having trouble getting enough paper because it is controlled by the government. In the last 5 years, 66 of newspapers had been closed. Only 7 years ago, the daily newspaper, when I was an editor, had a staff of hundreds of journalists. It doesn't exist anymore. More than 1,000 journalists, including myself, have had to leave the country because of threats, attacks, and arrests. Political changes and violence had marked my life as a journalist. But 2017 was different. Reporters covered the protests wearing helmets, bulletproof vests, and gas masks. My young friend saw protesters their age die, fighting for freedom. These young journalists have never known total freedom, but yet they defend it with their work. Covering protests in Venezuela can easily often lead to jail or exile. Doing investigative reporting in my country often leads to jail or exile. My friends, Edward, Joseph, Roberto, and Alfredo, all award-winning journalists from Armando Info, are now forced to live outside the country because of the reporting. And it's not just in Venezuela. In Nicaragua, Mexico, Honduras, and even Brazil, journalists are under attack. In Mexico, a journalist is killed every month on average, and hundreds more have been displaced. They have to leave their homes because they had been attacked, kidnapped, or threatened with being killed. In Nicaragua, journalists such as Carlos Chamorro have had to leave the country after the government raised of their offices. And in Brazil, the president is also telling audiences that journalists are the enemy. Today, I have the honor and responsibility to be here, and I'm lucky enough to tell you this story. But you should know that it was difficult for me to travel to London because my passport had run out of page, like many other journalists from Venezuela. I can't get a new passport from my country, and that makes it impossible to travel freely. This is another way that the government tried to control journalists. Despite the critical situation, many Venezuelan journalists have decided not to stay quiet and just watch out our funeral happen. These words are from Edward Schaffenberg, who inspired me to co-found the investigative news site Efecto Cocuyo with my partners, two brave journalists, Laura Wefer and Josefina Ruggiero. Our name, Efecto Cocuyo, in English translates to the firefly effect. We believe that in these darkest moments, tiny spark of information can illuminate an entire nation. Efecto Cocuyo is an independent Venezuelan media platform that delivers critical reporting and hard-hitting investigation in an era of growing limitations on citizens' ability to stay informed. Our team combines the energy of your writer with the experience of award-winning veteran journalists to cover stories that are increasingly being ignored by traditional media. These issues include the humanitarian crisis, the migration of millions of Venezuelans, and the search for justice by relatives and victims of human rights violations. Because of the censorship, many journalists turn to the internet, and fears allow new voices to find an online audience. But now, the government has begun to block us online, closing the only window that we have left. In her recent report of the violation of human rights in Venezuela, the United Nations High Commissioner, Mr. Michelle Bachelet, called on the Venezuelan government access to the internet and social network, including news website. The journalists who continue to work in Venezuela on our team, Efecto Cocuyo, and others, are forced to work in a difficult condition. They are going back in blackouts, and there is not enough petrol, food, and other basic necessities, such medicines, for example. Most Venezuelan journalists receive less than $100 per month as a salary. And in the midst of the worst economic crisis in the region, if you can ever find a product that you need, hyperinflation makes them too expensive. People ask me why Venezuelan journalists are still working in the country. I always say that the best answer to the attack is doing more and better journalism. If everyone leaves the country, who is going to tell the story of a nation that is living an humanitarian emergency? Who is going to tell the story of a country who is resisting and fighting to get back for democracy? I can go home right now, but I hope to go back soon. And I am so proud to the journalists who are still able to work there despite the challenges. If you share our passion for journalism, you have to recognize that journalists are very vulnerable. We need you have to take action to punish people who believe that they can kill a journalist with impunity. We need the support of people who believe in freedom of speech. 20 years ago in Venezuela, we could not have believed that the free press would be in danger of extinction. I come from the future, and I'm sorry to say that our experience is easily replicable in many other countries. The formula to reduce journalists is simple and effective, and governments in many countries are getting better at destroying the free press. As they do, they also destroy democracy. I want to end by thanking the many organizations that help journalists around the world, groups like CPJ that are working in Protect Us, Lumine that provide financial and consulting support, Open Society Foundation and the Program on Independent Journalists, Simbra Media, which provides sustainability support, research and training journalists, entrepreneurs in Latin America. And in Venezuela, we have to say thank you to the work of IPIS, Espacio Público, y Sindicato Nacional de Trabajadores de la Prensa. I have to say thank you also to my friend from Colombia. Your journalists from Colombia had been supportive with Venezuelan journalists in a way that we have writing very well. Finally, I want to recognize the 33 press freedom and media development organizations who met in London yesterday to call on all participating states to ensure the protection and safety of all journalists and media workers. They demand, and I support that, the release of imprisoned journalists, stop killing, attacking, and denigrating journalists, investigate and prosecute all murders of journalists. Today, our few countries led in the world, Norway, where journalists are really free to work. I would like to start a petition to appeal to governments around the world to create a special visa for journalists who need a safe place to go. When a journalist is killed, as has happened in Mexico, when a journalist is put in jail, as is happening in Nicaragua, when a journalist had to go into the exile, as is happening to me and my friends in Venezuela, not only do they silence those journalists, they silence many others and leave our society in the dark. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luz. Thank you for sharing your story. And thank you for the very brave work you do. I think your words are going to stay with us for a long time. I especially was struck by people getting together and saying, we're not going to stay quiet and watch over our own funeral. I like that fighting spirit. We're going to hear from another remarkable person now. Our next speaker, Anas Aramea Anas, is an investigative journalist and a graduate of the Ghana Institute of Journalism who studied law at the University of Ghana. Mr. Anas focuses on issues of human rights and corruption in Ghana and sub-Saharan Africa. He has won many awards for journalism and advocating against slavery and was named one of Foreign Policy Magazine's 2015 leading global thinkers. Anas.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I grew up in a military barracks, and it happened to be very interesting times in Ghanaian history because I saw it, how both the military and civil society tried to consolidate media freedom. Then I left the barracks and joined my newspaper, the New Crusading Guide, and learned under the formidable and energetic hands of Abdel Malik Kwekubako. the likes of the Kwesi Pratts, Kofi Kumsons, Audrey Gajepo, and many others. We learned to fight for media freedom. We learned to ensure and to consolidate the democracy that Ghana had. Moving on, I grew up and then became partners with Al Jazeera, BBC, many other international channels. Then I realized that my notion of what media freedom is about was changing. What was it? Me and my team at the BBC, Africa Eye, we had a project. We had a very important story to tell in Malawi. So we got together. It was about human harvest. We took all the security gadgets that we needed, went in. But that story still remains the most dangerous story that I have ever taken part in. It was a very simple operation that evening. But it didn't end well. Now, we had been able to film undercover the activities of these people who were killing. We had all on video. And one of them said we should go by a village, and then he's going to show us where, when they kill, where they bury the bodies. So we went there. Whilst filming, a community member raised an alarm that they've seen some people there. 1 led to 2, 3 led to 4, and over 100, 200, 300 people had gathered there. The killers had disappeared. We were left there. Who are you? We are from the BBC. That wouldn't stop them. They attacked us. Those who had knives used it on us. Those who had stones hit us with it. It was a heavy struggle to live. Eventually, we got to the chief's palace. The chief ordered them to stop. They tried to burn the chief's house and forcibly wanted to take us out and kill us. When we got back, the police intervened and then we got our freedom. I asked myself, why would this be happening? So I insisted with my colleagues that, look, we've got to go back to that community and find out why they wanted to kill us. Of course, this was against editorial policy, but I was interested because I needed to confront my fear and understand why a group of people somewhere would want to kill us for just doing a story. And the revelations are interesting. When we met the village, they said they had given up on the politician. And the last person they expected to give up on was the journalist, but they have given up on journalists. Because lots of people were getting killed in their villages and no journalist stood up for them. So they made up their mind, whether you are from Al Jazeera, BBC, anybody who comes on their land, they are going to kill you. The big lesson for me was simple, that if media freedom does not resonate with your other African colleagues or your other people in the world, then it's a wild goose chase. Then it means that all of us are going to face similar problems wherever we go. So it doesn't matter if it's in Venezuela and there is no freedom, it affects all of us. In recent times, there's been developments in Ghana that are quite worrying. I recall the death of Amal Clooney, one of the energetic reporters that ever joined the stable of Tiger Eye. I also acknowledge the fact that sometimes media people have been irresponsible. We know that. But hey, we are a mushrooming democracy. Just as our judiciary has its problems, the police has it, the media has its problems too. And I dare say, and would say it every day, when the politicians mounted the podium and said they will hang journalists and said that they would beat journalists, if government had spoken and had been firm about it, Amal Clooney would not have died. So when it comes to media responsibility, it's for all of us to stand up, say it as it is. Because truth is that the gun or the torture that was meted out to Ahmed Khashoggi, the gun that was used to shoot Ahmed Swali still lives. And that same gun will be used against the politician if we don't stand up and fight for media freedom. Again, I have been thinking, how do we empower these people who disrupt media freedom? It hurts me that the West will give us money in one hand to enhance our democracy. And in the same hand, people who disrupt this democracy and media freedoms are given the opportunity to stash their money in banks in the West. How can we be giving food in one hand and another hand being used to take the food from our mouths? When we continue to empower these people, give them safe homes, create problems in Ghana, run and come and stay in London, or run and go and stay in any other European country, has access to all his funds and can do anything, it hurts. Because it means that we are not looking at the fuller picture. The earlier we stand up and be straight with these people, the better for us. When top presidents take investigative pieces, and I'm talking about proper investigative pieces, and label them as fake news, then there is a problem. A huge problem. When you can attest and do fact check of this story, and yet a powerful president will look at it and just declare it's fake news, there is an issue. You see, the fake news that you sit in your little corner in your country and talk about, someone is also in another continent misinterpreting what you have said. You say fake news. He has misinterpreted it to mean that kill them all. So he goes after the journalists and kills them. After killing the journalists, the politician will be next. Thank you very much.
Okay, and now the pièce de résistance. We're going to hear from my co-host and really our host today, the person who had the great idea of organizing this conference, which we really hope is going to become an annual event and the beginning of a real collective effort by like-minded countries, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, Jeremy Hunt. Please, Jeremy.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the United Kingdom and our co-host, the Government of Canada, I am delighted to welcome you to this conference, and thank you, Chrystia, for your great support and enthusiasm for doing this conference and hopefully hosting one in Canada next year. Just 2 months ago, on the 16th of May, a 28-year-old Mexican reporter called Francisco Romero Diaz got a call before dawn about an incident in a nightclub in Playa del Carmen. Romero specialized in exposing organized crime. He responded as any good journalist should, by getting to the scene as quickly as possible. In fact, he was probably walking into a trap. As he arrived, Romero was ambushed and shot dead. He would have known the risks that he was taking. In the previous 2 months, he'd been detained by the police, allegedly for refusing to pay a bribe, and abducted by armed men. He'd been called anonymously by someone threatening to throw him off a bridge and claiming to know where his son went to school. And yet, despite every act of intimidation and harassment, Romero pressed on with reporting for the newspaper Quintana Roo and running a website focused on organized crime. He was the 6th journalist to be shot in Mexico this year. And then just 1 month ago, a 7th, Norma Sarabia, was shot dead in Tabasco State. Across the world, 99 journalists were killed last year, more than twice as many as a decade earlier, and another 348 were locked up by governments. Few perpetrators of these crimes are ever held to account. Indeed, after 11 years, of the 46 journalists who suffered violent deaths in 2008, only 8 cases have been resolved. Which is why our conference and this global campaign are so important. Our challenge is to honor the memory of Francisco Romero Diaz and others like him by protecting journalists and championing their work as a vital pillar of a free society. My friend Chrystia, as she said herself, a former journalist, and I are the first foreign ministers to convene an international conference on this subject. And as Chrystia said, we want this to become an annual event all over the world. And what is exciting amidst this bleak news is that we're joined today by delegations from over 100 countries, including 60 ministers, and more than 1,500 journalists, academics, and campaigners. Never before have so many countries come together in this cause. And today we send a resounding message that media freedom is not a Western value, but a universal value. At its best, a free media both protects society from the abuse of power and helps release the full potential of a nation. In 1887, the historian and politician Lord Acton wrote his famous words, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." The strongest safeguard against the dark side of power is accountability and scrutiny. And few institutions fulfill that role more effectively than a free media. Real accountability doesn't emerge from the selective and theatrical crackdowns on corruption mounted by authoritarian states, which mysteriously eliminate political opponents whilst leaving the biggest offenders untouched. Real accountability comes from the risk of exposure by a media that cannot be controlled or suborned. And the evidence for this is very clear. Of the 10 cleanest countries in the world, as ranked by Transparency International, 7 are also in the top 10 of the World Press Freedom Index. Meanwhile, of the 10 most corrupt countries, 4 are in the bottom 10 for media freedom. Now, powerful people value their reputations. So the sunlight of transparency is the greatest deterrent to wrongdoing. I'm a politician, and like many members of my profession, I don't always enjoy reading what the media says about me. Indeed, a politician who stands up for journalists might occasionally feel like a turkey voting for Christmas. And of course, I need to say, maybe my only chance, newspapers also make mistakes. Journalists are not immune from the temptations of hyperbole or excess. But for those of us who are sometimes on the receiving end of criticism, we should also reflect on the wisdom of Nelson Mandela, when he said, "The media are a mirror through which we see ourselves and others perceive us, warts, blemishes, and all. Such criticism can only help us to grow by calling attention to those of our actions and omissions which do not measure up to our people's expectations." So if we're wise, we politicians will treat the media as a critical friend. Our officials might tell us what we want to hear. The media tell us what we need to hear, providing unvarnished reality whether we wish it or not. But a free media does more than just criticize failure and deter wrongdoing. It also nurtures and nourishes the progress of ideas. Throughout history, humanity has achieved its swiftest progress when we've allowed ideas to be freely debated, tested, and challenged. No discovery was ever achieved and no invention perfected by the suffocating tools of suppression or censorship. The open exchange of ideas through a free media allows the genius of a society to breathe, releasing the originality and creativity of the entire population. As the great thinker John Stuart Mill wrote, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race. If the opinion is right, they're deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If it's wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Societies which embrace free debate make a disproportionate contribution to the advance of human knowledge. The 10 nations with the freest media in the world have produced 120 Nobel laureates between them, 3 times as many as Russia and China combined. Norway, with only 5 million people, has won 13 Nobel Prizes. And with great respect to my Norwegian friends, Norwegians are no more pioneering or inventive than anyone else. They've flourished because their open society and free media, ranked the freest in the world, have created the very best setting for their talents to thrive. In other countries, life is tougher, but journalists are succeeding against the odds. In Venezuela, we just heard from Luzmela Reyes, who has defied the Maduro regime by co-founding her independent news website, Efecto Cocuyo. In Kazakhstan, Gulnara Bakanova runs the website Holonews, which exposed how fish stocks in the Ural River have been devastated by poisoning. In Peru, Gustavo Gorriti of IDL Reporteros has brought to light a series of corruption scandals involving business, the government, and the judiciary. But sadly, in many countries, the situation continues to deteriorate. In China, automated censorship and the Great Firewall block access to thousands of news websites, with millions of people employed to censor content, fake social media posts, and manipulate online debate. The first person to establish a website in China focused on human rights was an activist called Quan Chi. He was jailed in 2016, and nothing has been heard from him since a secret trial in January, though he's in poor health. Now, we've raised the case with the Chinese authorities, and I urge them again to disclose Quan Chi's fate and provide the medical care he needs. In Vietnam, Trang Thi Nga produced video evidence of police brutality, only to get a 9-year prison sentence in 2017. So again today I call on the Vietnamese authorities to release her. In a world where Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi was murdered inside a Saudi diplomatic property, and talented young journalist Lyra McKee was shot dead by dissident Republicans in Northern Ireland, it would be easy to succumb to fatalism. But we must resist that, because if we act together, we can shine a spotlight on abuses and impose a diplomatic price on those who'd harm journalists or lock them up for doing their jobs. So today I want to announce 5 practical steps the British government will take alongside our partners. Firstly, we'll join other governments to establish a new global media defence fund to be administered by UNESCO. This will take forward the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists. Among the aims will be to help fund legal advice for journalists and safety training for those venturing into conflict zones. Britain will provide £3 million to the fund over the next 5 years, and we invite others to contribute. Secondly, we'll establish an international task force to help governments deliver their commitments on media freedom, including by developing national action plans. Every year at the UN General Assembly, we'll meet to review progress of the task force, commending those countries where media freedom is getting better and agreeing what should be done when it's not. Thirdly, my special envoy, Amal Clooney, has convened a panel of experts to advise countries on how to strengthen the legal protection of journalists, and I'd encourage all governments to draw on the advice of that panel and respond to its recommendations. For our part, the British government will ensure that whenever we propose or amend a law, we will consider the potential impact on press freedom. And earlier today, my colleague, Minister Harriet Baldwin, announced that our Department for International Development will spend up to £15 million on new programmes to promote media freedom across the world. Fourthly, Chrystia, Freeland and I will bring together a contact group of like-minded countries to lobby in unison when media freedom comes under attack. Our aim is for this to be a rapid response mechanism, helping foreign ministers and ambassadors to react as one when abuses take place. And finally, I invite every country represented here to sign the Global Pledge on Media Freedom, resolving that we'll work together as a coalition to promote this cause and meet again next year. Colleagues, the struggle for media freedom is being waged day after day, not in conference centres like this, but by independent journalists in authoritarian states, by vigilant bloggers who expose corruption, and by courageous activists who publish the evidence of human rights abuses. There is no place for neutrality in this struggle. We are on the side of those who seek to report the truth and bring the facts to light. We stand against those who suppress or censor or exact revenge. After the killing of Francisco Romero Diaz, his newspaper carried the headline, "Pain, Fear and Impotence," and declared the voice of a journalist has been silenced. In the end, we all face a choice. Ignore the threats, and we tolerate the stifling of independent voices and the dangers of unaccountable power. But defend our values, and nations will flourish from the free exchange of ideas. By coming to this conference, each and every one of the 1,000 people here has made that choice. We've pledged to do what it takes and no less to ensure that instead of being silenced, the plural and varied voices of a free media are nurtured and encouraged as the most important contribution to the open societies that are the foundation of human progress. Thank you very much.
Well, that was very inspiring, Jeremy. What a clarion call to action. Thank you. And I also appreciated the moment of wry self-reflection in the turkeys voting for Christmas line. I saw a lot of sympathy flitting across the faces of fellow politicians. Last of all, and joining us from the floor, it's my pleasure to invite Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Women, our colleague Maurice Payne, to make a few comments. Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Chrystia. And firstly, let me acknowledge both you and Jeremy, Canada and the United Kingdom, for your leadership and your promotion of media freedom through convening this conference, and also in enabling me to speak this afternoon rather out of order in terms of proceedings, because I go straight from here to the airport to fly to Auckland in New Zealand to speak at a conference there on Friday morning. And the world is just a tad larger than I can manage to fit into 24 hours. Secondly, can I thank all of you and all of our speakers who are here this afternoon for their insightful and compelling remarks. I want to begin by making the observation, and these are brief remarks, I assure you, that freedom of expression, including media freedom, is a basic human right and a fundamental element of vibrant democracies. Australia is an open, liberal democracy guided by the rule of law and strongly supports the principles of free press and the safety of journalists. And that is why we are pleased to participate in today's conference. It's also why we are taking practical steps in our own region with our partners to build professional and sustainable media industries across that region. Journalists and the media play an essential role in generating the accountability that underpins good governance and strong institutions. So, for example, in the Pacific, Australia's Pacific Media Assistance Scheme is training the next generation of journalists and media practitioners. In the United Nations, including as a member of the Human Rights Council, Australia has been strong and clear in our support for the protection of journalists and the rights to freedom of expression. Australia deplores the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And Australia is also deeply concerned at the open abuse of the Vienna Conventions caused by the commission and concealment of this crime. We thank the UN Special Rapporteur, Dr. Agnes Callamard, with whom I've met this afternoon, for her investigation into the murder. Her report is a very valuable contribution to the transparency and accountability of this issue and a critical step towards establishing the truth of these circumstances. Australia also raises media freedom issues bilaterally, as Amal Clooney knows, as we did in the case of the Reuters journalists in Myanmar last year, including in my own visit to Myanmar in December. Their release in May was certainly due to many factors, including decisions in the Myanmar system and also including the many representations made publicly, privately, by like-minded nations, by the United Nations, by civil society. Press freedom has recently been the focus of national discussion in Australia. While Australia ranks relatively highly on the World Press Freedom Index, we recognise that a sensible balance needs to be reached between protecting our national interest in the face of ever-evolving security challenges and upholding the public's right to know. Recognising this, the Australian Government has asked a senior parliamentary committee, the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, to conduct an inquiry into how law enforcement and intelligence powers interact with protections for journalists and press freedom to ensure that we strike the right balance. The Australian Government has also directly invited media organisations to provide their submissions straight to Government on key issues of concern to them, and Government is looking forward to working with them over the coming months. I firmly believe, and agree with those who have already said it this afternoon, that it is important for like-minded nations to speak and to act together to promote media freedom around the world. And Australia will continue to do that in our region and across the globe. It's not without its challenges, but working together, we can better nurture the ongoing growth and resilience of the media worldwide. Thank you again for your indulgence this afternoon. It is very much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Maurice. And in the time that I've worked with Maurice as a fellow Foreign Minister, she's been a fantastic champion of democratic values. So thank you for making this, I think, the longest journey of anyone to come to this conference. We're absolutely delighted that you made it. Now, it wouldn't be a conference on media freedom if we didn't have a few questions from the media. And because we do have media freedom in this country, we don't know what those questions might be, and some of them might even veer slightly away from the topics that we've been discussing this afternoon. We shall see. Anyway, we're going to have those questions now, and then I think we'll take a break because it's quite hot in here, uncharacteristically for this country. So we'll start with Nick Miller from the Sydney Morning Herald.
Hi, over to your left here. Nick Miller, over here to your left.
Nick, hi.
Hi there. Sorry, it's Australians everywhere. It's like a Soho coffee shop. I wanted to pick up on something Amal Clooney said, but also challenge the rest of the panel. In Australia recently, as you said, police have raided journalistic offices and houses. They've scoured phone metadata of journalists and travel records, and they've not ruled out prosecution over the publication of leaked material. Amal, you mentioned that press freedom is not just a matter of authoritarian regimes, which are easy to criticise from this stage, but everywhere. I would ask specifically what the panel would comment whether Australia sounds like they are balancing press freedom correctly, and more generally, are liberal democracies in danger of hurting press freedom in the name of national security?
Yes, they're in danger of hurting. I mean, all the reports compiled on the state of press freedom in the world today say the decline is not only limited to non-democracies, and so we have to be vigilant, and we also have to know that what happens in a country like Australia or the UK or the US will be looked at by every other leader in the world and potentially used as an excuse to clamp down even further on journalists, and they would, you know, I think journalists all over the world are less safe if the rhetoric or even policies or laws in states that are supposed to be free are actually a threat to journalists in those countries. So, you know, in terms of what this campaign can do, one of the things that the legal panel can contribute is to set out what minimum international standards are, so that when governments are conducting inquiries into where the balance should lie under their national laws, they at least make sure they don't fall below the minimum international standards that 173 states have signed up to in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
I would just add, Nick, that, you know, I don't know the details of the issue in Australia, but the UK only comes 33rd in the World Press Freedom Rankings, and that says that we're not perfect, and we have got things that we need to do better, and I think we have to be completely open-minded about this. I think the big battle in the 21st century is going to be between open and closed societies, and those of us that believe in open societies have to practice what we preach. We have to be prepared to subject ourselves to scrutiny, as Maurice is by being here and listening to your questions and responding to that in her comments earlier. You know, it's very important that we are open about what we can improve and also get that balance between security and basic freedoms right, because we know that the security card is going to be used by repressive regimes all over the world, so it's absolutely essential that we draw that line in the right place and do so in a way that we can defend and is sensible for our values.
Yeah, so I won't astonish you, Nick, by agreeing with what Jeremy has said. I think it's great that Maurice is here, and she addressed your question in her comments. I would also say, speaking for Canada, we are far from believing ourselves to be perfect. We think we have a lot of work to do at home in sort of the broader liberal democracy set of questions. I would say for us as Canadians, our big concern is Indigenous people in Canada and reconciliation with Indigenous people, and we're working on it, but we have a long way to go. And to your question about liberal democracy, I think 100% it is under threat in self-described liberal democracies as well as around the world. And I think that's really, you know, that is the motivating idea for us to convene everyone here. I mean, we are living in, I think, a really worrying time when authoritarianism is on the rise and liberal democracy is under threat, more so, I think, than at any time since the Second World War. And part of it is, you know, this challenge of balancing security and freedom. But I think, you know, also it is, as Jeremy said in his remarks, the terrible temptations of power. And, you know, with, when it comes to journalists, there is a little bit of a paradox in having politicians standing up for media freedom, because there is a structural conflict between journalists and politicians. You know, journalists, when you guys are doing your jobs, you are calling us to account and you are in conflict with us. Your favorite press conference is one where we don't have a good answer to your questions. That's a good press conference. You do not ask questions to allow us to talk about how great we are. And inevitably, for political leaders, that experience is not always so fun. And so there is this constant temptation by governments, even in the most liberal societies, to kind of say, well, you know, do we really need that much holding of our own feet to the fire? And I think it's really important for us collectively to remind ourselves that, you know, just as in Canada, we have Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. It's the political party that sits across the aisle from me in the House. Every day when the House is sitting, they have an hour to ask questions. Those questions are often even more painful than the ones asked by journalists. But in the very name of them, the loyal opposition, we recognize the absolutely critical function they play in our democracy. And I think part of the exercise of being here is for us, you know, as democratic leaders, to remind ourselves and remind each other that, you know, sometimes cantankerous, sometimes quarrelsome, always when it's doing its job difficult, media is the foundation of our democracies.
Thank you. Just so I can get through a few more journalists, we won't all three of us answer every question going forward, but Derek Stoffel from CBC.
I fear he may be for me.
Yes, right here, from the CBC. My question, well, I will direct it toward Minister Freeland, but if the Foreign Secretary, Ms. Clooney, do want to answer that, I'd be grateful. There's been a lot of discussion at this conference about the terrible killing of Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul. And, you know, at a conference about media freedom as journalists, we can't get an answer if there are Saudi delegates here, Saudi participants, which is disappointing. But from the people here who, you know, are speaking in the sessions, there is disappointment that the upcoming G20 in 2020 will be held in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. So, Minister, is it appropriate that such an important gathering take place in Saudi Arabia, and is Canada putting pressure on other nations to have the meeting moved?
Let me just say one word about Jamal Khashoggi, which is, you know, I very much share your view, I think probably a universal view here, that was an atrocious murder, that those responsible must be held to account. I was glad that Maurice mentioned the important work done by Agnès Calamar. I've met with her in person and spoken to her. We really support her work, and Canada has sanctioned 17 Saudi officials in connection with that killing. So I definitely share the concern. On the G20, I think that it is important, as an ardent supporter of multilateralism, to distinguish between two different kinds of multilateral groups. There are some multilateral organizations that are about like-minded countries who choose to be partners with each other because of their shared values and shared objectives, really value and alliance-based organizations. I would say NATO is such an organization. The Equal Rights Coalition, which is a group of countries that has come together to support LGBTQ2 rights, is another values-based multilateral group. But there are other groups like the UN, like the G20, which are not actually values-based, which are groups of countries who exist in the case of the UN so that there can be a platform where all countries in the world can meet and talk. In the case of the G20, very much initially brought together so that the world's largest economies had a forum where they could meet to work together to address issues that really needed to be addressed at a global level. There are other countries at the G7 that Canada has serious concerns, at the G20, sorry, at the G20 that Canada has very serious concerns about. For example, Russia. and we speak out strongly against the annexation and occupation of the Crimea, Russia's continued aggression in the Donbass, use of banned chemical agents in the United Kingdom. Nonetheless, we meet with the Russians inside the G20 because it's important to have a forum like that. The G7 is quite different. And when Canada hosted the G7 last year in Charlevoix, the Prime Minister was very clear that Russia was not welcome at the G7, having been expelled following the invasion and annexation of Crimea. So I do think that it's important for us in the multilateral space to have groups of like-minded countries where we share our values. That's why we're doing things together. But also we do need to have places where we can meet and talk, even with those countries that are acting in ways that are 100% opposed to our values.
Thank you. Stephanie Bolton.
In French, for our colleagues in...
Okay, do you want to say something?
Oui. Merci pour la question. Pour le Canada,
Thank you for the question. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi was something very serious, and of course we condemn the murder of this Saudi journalist. As far as the G20 is concerned, I think it's very important to differentiate between the multilateral groups and the organizations that are founded by shared values. For example, NATO, our military alliance, the Coalition for Equality. But there are other organizations, such as United Nations, such as the G20, that are not organizations which are based on shared values, but they are places where countries can discuss. And that's also something that's necessary to have.
Bolton from Die Welt.
Yeah, thank you. My first question goes to Ms. Clooney.
Sorry, just one question, if that's all right, because we haven't got time.
A very short one for you, Foreign Secretary. Our Turkey correspondent in February 2017 was arrested and spent a year in Istanbul in jail because of allegations that the Turkey's constitutional court only at the end of June ruled as illegal. Since you are looking here at legal frameworks, would you want the European Union to sanction the governments of EU candidate countries who violate press freedom by suspending the accession process? And very briefly to the Foreign Secretary, the publication of the diplomatic reports from Kim Darroch in Washington would not have been possible in countries where there's no press freedom. Still, should there be limits drawn to media freedom to protect a government's national security interests? Thank you.
If I can just comment actually to both questions, because this is something in common. I think one of the most effective tools we have in the human rights world is sanctions. And I very much commend my colleague Agnes Kalamar for what she's done in putting together some recommendations on what should be done in response to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. One of the things that she says is the sanctions that were put in place were insufficient. And I think whether it's Turkey or Saudi Arabia or any other state, we should be looking towards having a much more robust set of sanctions that are available to be imposed and then that are actually imposed in a more consistent manner. We have a handful of states at the moment that have Magnitsky-style legislation, and one of the things that the legal panel will be looking at as a priority is looking at the existing legislation that exists, looking at sort of what's a good model to be adopted, but then also looking at not only where it's on the books, but how it should be used by states more effectively. Because I very much heard the plea by the journalist from Ghana earlier who said, you know, thanks to the West for supporting our countries and becoming more democratic, but if you're still going to allow the use of Western banks, or if you're still allowing some of the worst human rights violators to come into our countries and use our banking system, then maybe you're not using, you know, one of the most effective tools at your disposal. So I think this is a really important issue and something that I hope the panel will be able to issue recommendations on as a priority.
Just to briefly answer your question, yes, there are always limits to press freedom on matters of national security, but they're not covered by the leak of these particular diplomatic telegrams. And I deplore those leaks because, as Foreign Secretary, I need to get confidential correspondence from my ambassadors all around the world. But I defend to the hilt the right of the press to publish them if they receive them, because that is what you have to do your job. We'll just take Jonathan Rugman from Channel 4. Here or not here? Not here? Oh.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. President Trump has described the so-called mainstream media and professional journalists as the enemy of the people. He has called us very dangerous and sick. Is it not appropriate at an event like this for you to condemn those remarks, given that many journalists and the journalists in this room feel that the working environment in which we operate has become less safe because of them? And secondly, do you believe that Sir Kim Darroch resigned because Boris Johnson failed to fully support him in your debate with him last night? And do you believe that the former Foreign Secretary should have defended him more?
Well, Boris can speak for himself, and he's very capable of doing that. I will speak for myself. I think it is absolutely essential that when our diplomats do their job all over the world, and in this case, Sir Kim Darroch was a very experienced diplomat, we defend them, because we have the third largest diplomatic network after the United States and China. And it is incredibly important, both for the United Kingdom and for the defence of the values that the United Kingdom supports, like press freedom. And so in this situation, we had a fine diplomat who was just doing what he should have been doing, giving a frank assessment, a personal assessment of the political situation in the country that he was posted, and that's why I defended him, and I think we all should. On your second question, I wouldn't use the language President Trump used, and I wouldn't agree with it. And I think we have to remember, whatever the political battles that we face in countries where we are used to press freedom, and it's part of our daily lives, and we've never known anything else, we have to remember that what we say can have an impact in other countries where they can't take press freedom for granted. And that's why this conference is so important, because for the first time we are flying the flag for that awkward tension between politicians and journalists, where we have that symbiotic relationship where we each make the other one's life difficult, but actually what we end up with is not just freer but stronger societies. I'm going to call as the last question Melanie Nagy from CTC.
CTV, but that's okay.
Sorry,
no,
CTV.
That's okay. So many questions I'd like to ask, but I'm just going to return to a tenet of basic journalism you're taught young at a J school: follow the money. And on this, I'm going to refer to it as in your action statement. You've talked about pledges, you've talked about strategies, working groups. But what about, say, Minister, in Canada or even in the UK, walking away from trade deals, walking away from business agreements, with countries that repeatedly violate media rights? I mean, especially if it's going to cost you, but also cost you in popularity at home, and perhaps could even cost you your elected job. You know, making those tough decisions, breaking business deals with countries that continue to violate basic rights of journalists.
I think we have to be prepared to do that. And I think we have to be prepared to do that not only as politicians, but as societies. So, you know, I firmly believe that a values-based foreign policy is the right foreign policy for Canada. And I hope when we face our elections in October, Canadians will show that they agree with that. Canada has been prepared to speak up against abuses of human rights and for human rights defenders around the world. And as the Canadian journalists here know, we've paid a price in some of those instances. And we have also imposed sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions, but also economic sanctions on countries that we believe are violating the rules-based international order, you know, like Russia over Crimea, where there's an economic cost as well. And I think we need to be prepared to do that. Now, you know, a country is not an NGO. And we can't be cavalier about making those statements or making those judgments. But I think if we believe that human rights around the world are universal, and that a world where human rights are honored more rather than less, and in human rights I include a free press, we do sometimes have to be prepared to recognize that there will be an economic cost. It's also, it's hard to do, and it's hard for one country to do by itself. And one of the realizations that I think, inspired Jeremy to have the great idea to have this conference, and which is why we are so enthusiastically supporting him, is I believe that it's easier for Canada, it's easier for like-minded countries to speak up when you're not alone. And when a group of like-minded countries can speak up on human rights in general, but we've here very specifically said we're going to do it for journalists and for media freedom, I think that's going to give us more power and ability to act, and that's part of the reason to be here together.
Thank you. Let me just give a quick comment to that, Melanie, before we wrap up. I think we have to be honest with the people in our countries, in the democracies, the people who we represent, that we have lots of priorities. It is our job to create prosperity, to create jobs for people, and it is our job to protect security. And so we have multiple aims if we're going to govern our countries properly. We also have to be honest with people that the way you achieve results will be different with different countries. In some countries, the right way to do it is to call things out publicly. In other countries, the right way to do it is through private contacts, and both of those work, but the crucial thing is that you do something, not nothing. But in the end, certainly speaking for the people of the United Kingdom, they do want a government that stands up for the values that they believe in. And they do believe, as I'm sure everyone here believes, that if we don't take a public stand for the things we believe in the end, no one else will, and those values will come under threat. So getting that balance right is very, very important. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. That concludes this plenary session. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. Please remain in your seats while the speakers leave the hall.